All right, so as we get started, before I start the lecture, does anyone have any questions about the quiz? It has been open since last night. I know that there was a question about number of attempts. I had to go back and edit that, which I thought I edited it. Yes, there's one attempt for the quiz. So just in case you were wondering. Any questions about that?
Yes, I have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so there is a take quiz button. So if I click that, can I log out or I have to just finish it?
Basically, if you do the take quiz, essentially you have to finish it, but you have the opportunity of submitting the quiz at the end. But that's why I suggest copying the code or copying the questions into a document once you hit the take quiz, and then that way you don't lose any of your code or anything.
So where is the question then? I didn't find any question there.
Hold on just a second. There should be questions there. All right. Let me check. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. Let me check the quiz. I did have it open. All right. Oh boy. Okay, quiz number 2. All right. I see the questions. Do you not see the questions, Aisha?
Those are the questions, just code structure and efficiency, syntax, those?
No, that's the description.
Yeah, so I don't see any question. Where are those? So I have to click take the
Yes,
quiz.
you actually have to take the quiz to start to see the questions, yes.
So I don't need to submit at the time, right?
Pardon me?
Do I have to submit? Like I can close my computer or?
Yes, but you have to click the take quiz button to start the quiz.
Yeah, so I did now, but if I log out my computer, so then it will go away, right?
Right, so that's why I suggest while the quiz is open, you can copy the questions into an external doc and work on them that way.
Yeah, so if you give us like 10 days, do you have to just open the computer 10 days? That's my question.
No, you can close it. You just go back to the quiz and then you can upload your document or answer the questions.
So my my quiz, like my Canvas will not log out.
Right, so the quiz will remain active until you click the submit quiz button at the bottom.
Even though I log out from Canvas?
Yes, it'll remain active. You won't lose access to the quiz as long as you haven't clicked the submit quiz button.
Okay, so that was my question. So
okay.
if I just open that, then
Yeah,
I
so once,
can, okay.
yeah, so once you click take quiz, the quiz is now active. And there's no time limit, it just remains active until you hit the submit quiz button, then it closes.
Yeah, so so I can log out Canvas, then come back, right?
Right, right.
Okay, it will not go away.
No, it's
Just
not gonna, it won't go away. You'll be
okay.
fine.
So okay, that was my question. I never did like that. Like when quiz open, I just did it.
Right?
So not like I open more than one day like that. So
Well, yes, and that's, with Canvas, the way it's set up now, I mean, as long as you don't submit the quiz is active. And
oh, okay.
basically, you can go back in, and it'll auto save your work too, but I would suggest, just to be safe, since the questions are essentially changing and building code, so I definitely would go about it that way.
Okay. Okay then. Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Mhm.
All right, good. Okay, so let me go back. Any other questions about the quiz? Oops, speak
No.
up now or forever hold your peace. All right, so let me share the PowerPoint again. All right. Okay, so we're in week 12. We're winding down to the end. Let me go through this lecture on this module. And yes, if you have any general questions about the quiz, you can ask those. But I can't, I can't answer questions about the code or anything like that. All right. So in module 12, the title is Improving PL SQL Performance. And generally, the purpose of this, and as you may have guessed, there's several ways to actually accomplish some of the tasks in PL SQL. So there's no really best or right answer. At this juncture, especially in your experience with this particular programming scenario, I mean, it's truly what's comfortable for you, right? So basically, in this section or module, you're going to learn to construct and execute SQL statements dynamically, and all that means is that there's a way that you can use PL SQL to do dynamic coding um, as far as queries. And we call this native dynamic SQL statements. Basically, you also gain an understanding of clauses and things that can drive performance improvement. You'll see that there's several ways, building subprograms, calling functions, using cursors. I mean, this doesn't substitute for that. This is just another method to understand the usefulness of the language. So basically, in lesson 1, using dynamic SQL, we call the stages through which all SQL statements pass, describe the reasons for using dynamic SQL to create a SQL statement. Oh, someone's trying to get in. And just to reiterate, dynamic SQL, and you'll see this is just really a way to use PL SQL to build SQL. This is often used in other programming languages. The PL SQL version or native dynamic SQL, it can be useful, but it can be arduous as well, so remember that. So it doesn't mean that you have to use this method and for your upcoming database manipulation, but it is another one of these options, programming options. So, and then describe the benefits of execute immediate over DBMS SQL for dynamic SQL, which is what you're running now. And so the purpose of this lesson is just basically to run, if there was a scenario where you have to actually build the query, then you would use a native dynamic SQL statement to do that. Dynamically executing SQL and PL SQL code extends the capabilities of PL SQL, and it really depends on how you look at it. It extends the capabilities. It also extends the confusion how PL SQL works. Let's see. I just want to make sure we have everyone because I have some. So Eric, are you on now? Are you one of these mysterious participants? No response. Let's see, who else are we missing? Daniel's here. How about Jesus? Are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So Eric, are you on or not?
I am now.
Okay, all right. And how about Peter? Peter, are you on? All right, well, let's continue. Okay, this lesson also compares basically native dynamic SQL to DBMS SQL package, or basically what you're running right now. I think I said that before. So as far as the execution flow of SQL, all SQL statements in a database, they go through various stages and they're very, very similar. You have a parsing or pre-execution, if possible phase where the syntax is checked, objects are checked to see if they exist, and all these pre-checks that happen before you actually execute. You have a binding phase, just basically getting the value, the literals of the variables, et cetera, making sure everything is set. The first phase is always the most critical one, syntax and objects. And then the execution phase is just that. And then basically the result phase. And all queries go through these four primary phases: parse, bind, execute, fetch.
Can I ask a quick question? Just real clarification on the bind. Is this what they, because I was kind of searching online because I had a little bit of a difficult time trying to understand this. Is this what you would call binding variables? Is this the same thing?
It's the same thing, absolutely. It's the same thing as any programming language. You're just binding variables. You're ensuring that those literal values are correct and making sure that these variables are now ready to be utilized through the execution phase. Okay. All right. So essentially, some stages may not be relevant, but generally, with SQL, and from a very, very, very high level explanation, this is you're looking at how most programs will work, compile to execute to results. Okay, when a SQL statement is included in a PL SQL program, the parse and bind phases are normally done at compile. And yes, it's generally your compiler is the one that's checking syntax, binding variables, etc. So when the procedure, for example, when a procedure package function or the package body is created, it's usually doing those two phases. Can't speak. Well, actually, it's doing the compile phase. So what if the text of a SQL statement is not when the procedure is created? See. There was a question there. I forgot what I was trying to ask there. What if the text of the SQL statement is not on it? Well, anyway, I'll figure that out. I forget what. All right. So the execution flow of SQL or PL SQL. How could the Oracle server parse it? It couldn't. So these are just basically scenarios as to how your oh, there's Peter. How your SQL program or your SQL code will run. For example, suppose you want to drop a table, but a user enters the table. Basically, someone is trying to manipulate or enter the table at execution time. And basically, you will receive a cannot be parsed as one of your error messages. And this is why. I mean, you can't run like that particular DDL when the table is being, and this is the protection and constraints as well within your database. So when you see these errors like cannot parse or cannot bind, just think about these stages of your SQL code. Okay,
sorry, I just want to make a comment. So if that is the case, then if it says if it says cannot parse, that basically means that the information is incorrect from the I'm sorry, the I guess what's being requested, what's being asked of is not set up correctly. Is that the reason why we have these error messages?
No, well, remember the parse phase is basically your checking phase to make sure everything is in alignment before everything is bound and executed. So when you get a cannot parse, it means it really can't even begin to prepare the table to be dropped in this example.
Okay.
So basically it says no, cannot parse, so this program will not run. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an error in your code. It just means that either, depending on the scenario, either you have to wait or figure out, what else is happening to that table. All right?
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, so dynamic SQL. You can use dynamic SQL to create SQL statements whose text is not completely known in advance. So, and it's just like any other dynamic. Let's say you don't know, you're not sure if you're going to run an update or a delete or a select or whatever. Let's say it depends upon some type of application or some type of status. So you can essentially have dynamic SQL running to create the actual SQL code. And it's conditional. It's based on scenario. It's simply that, it's dynamic. It could be several things, or it will have the ability to create several things as far as a SQL. So dynamic SQL is constructed and stored as a character string within a subprogram. So you actually create the SQL statement within as a string, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Dynamic SQL is a SQL statement with varying column data or different conditions. And basically, they're based on placeholders or bind variables. And once again, it's conditional. There's certain conditions that have to be met, and then a certain SQL statement will be created. It enables data definition, data control, or session control statements to be written and executed from PL SQL. So that essentially you can do everything, well, most everything in a dynamic SQL scenario if you have some unknowns, and that's primarily the purpose. Question? Or that's just, okay. Dynamic SQL does not, PL SQL does not support DDL statements written directly in a program. We all know that. So native dynamic SQL, or NDS, allows you to work around this by constructing and storing DDL statements or SQL statements in a character string. So you can run them in PL SQL, so you essentially bypass that restriction. NDS provides native support for dynamic SQL. In PL SQL, it enables data definition, and didn't I just say that? Yeah. All right. So native dynamic SQL is executed with native dynamic SQL statements, execute immediate, and excuse me. Execute immediate or within the DBMS SQL package, and I'll show you what that is here in a second. NDS provides the ability to execute SQL statements whose structure is unknown until execution time, which is key. Can also use the open for and fetch and close PL SQL statements. All right. So using the execute immediate statement, and in case you're wondering, that's essentially, it is exactly how it reads. You're basically demanding or commanding the program to execute once this SQL statement is built, and I'll show you what I mean there. So you use the execute immediate statement for native dynamic SQL on PL SQL anonymous blocks or subprograms. So if you look at that example, execute immediate, and you have some type of dynamic string, and this is a string, meaning it's surrounded by single quotes, and then you have an into, and then using, and then you have bind arguments or variable bind arguments where you're imposing the NDS on those defined variables. So into is used for single row queries and specify the variables or records into which the columns value, basically where the columns are retrieved. You can use holds. Using holds all bind arguments, meaning, and all that means is that if you have those variables defined correctly, I mean, you're actually pushing the binds that stage of your SQL so that everything is in place when the dynamic SQL statement is created. The default parameter mode for this is always in, and that's pretty standard for a subprogram anyway. Your default is always an input variable. All right. Well, we may run out of time, but I'll just restart our session if needed, because I was trying to eliminate the need to upgrade. All right. And I will post a lecture just in case we need to review. Further defining this particular example, dynamic string is a character variable or literal containing the text of the SQL. Basically, usually it's the literal containing the text, the SQL statement text. Defined variable is a PL SQL variable that stores a selected column. Record is a user defined or row type record that stores a selected row. And basically data type, and essentially you're defining those parameters, well, technically dynamically. So when you construct a dynamic statement inline, for example, let's look at create a procedure, drop any table, and drop any table. That's the name of the procedure, and basically you have a table name as a varchar, and basically in that very simple example, we're going to drop a table based on some conditions. So executable section of this anonymous block is we're sending the command, the NDS command, execute immediately, drop table, and then whatever the table name is that's passed in as a parameter. So, and then constructing a dynamic statement in a variable. The second part of the example, create procedure, drop any table. Basically the same syntax is, we're calling it v dynamic statement varchar. And then the statement is drop table and table name. And then you're executing that immediately after the parameters are sent. And then the anonymous block at the very end of that is basically using the drop table NDS to drop any table to drop the employee names table. And it's basically like, it's very, very similar to dropping using a store procedure to do the same thing. And this is another example, and this is using a function, delete rows. The first basically is creating the function, and then the second is actually executing the function. And primarily you would enter the variable, the number of rows to be deleted, et cetera, and then it will give you an output of the rows that have been deleted based on that dynamic SQL. Okay, third example. Basically, an NDS with DML. So here's an example of inserting a row and table with 2 columns. So note the use of the escape single quotes. And that looks a bit confusing, but you know that if you have string literals, they have to be surrounded by quotes. So that's why you have escape quotes. Basically, that's these three quotes will surround this literal value, PID, with single quotes. Although usually in the ID, you don't need a quote because ID is a numbers. But because we need to build that as a dynamic string, it's just basically going to add this insert into, remember, this is building the actual query, insert into this table, and then the values, and then, yes, so I'm confusing myself. The PID is not going to be surrounded by quotes, but the P name is using the escape quotes. That's why you have the 3 here. So P name will be surrounded by single quotes, as shown in this representation of the dynamic SQL. All right, so you can use NDS to recompile PL SQL code. You can recompile PL SQL objects without recreating them. So this alter procedure, procedure name, compile, alter function, alter package, etc. Compile specification, compile that. All you're doing is just compiling or recompiling these particular, remember compiling is just to reiterate, that's just the parse and bind phase, just to make sure, and it's just a checking phase before execution. Because remember, when you create a procedure or a function or a package, it has to be compiled first before you can execute it. Okay, so this example creates a procedure that recompiles. So within this procedure, you're actually recompiling the procedure and then launching it or executing. Okay, so using the DBMS SQL package, which is another package, and you all know what a package is. It's just a collection of subprograms that can be actually executed with certain commands. You can actually break them down using this particular function in PL SQL. Things like open cursor, parse, bind variables, execute, fetch rows, and close cursor. And these should not surprise you as far as commands. So yes, you can actually use DBMS PL SQL commands to actually run through a PL SQL or SQL statement. So here's a function that we're actually using the DBMS SQL. As you look through this, we're opening a cursor, we're parsing, and we're also executing parts of it, and we're closing the cursor, all within a function. So it's almost like a sub program running for specific reasons. So if you compare this with the delete rows function from earlier, it does the same thing, but obviously this particular version is much more complex. And that's why it's asking, it looks like the functionality is identical, but the previous version, which was just a function, yeah. So this is probably not a good example to run DBMS. And I can tell you right now, DBMS SQL is usually put together for more complex scenarios. You wouldn't want to run something simple like deleting rows in a table because you end up writing something like this, whereas your SQL would normally do that without all of this complexity. So you can also use DBMS SQL in a parameterized DML statement, which just means you have parameters, usually input parameters. And what we're trying to illustrate here is that generally you don't want to write something like this when you can do it in a simpler fashion as far as a store procedure. because if you're building something dynamically, that really doesn't need to be built. So is NDS, or native dynamic SQL, is obviously easier to use than DBMS SQL. Requires less code, often executes fast. It'll definitely execute faster. It's essentially giving you an illustration of another way to dynamically build SQL, which you probably don't need to use. All right, so the terminology, and we'll probably lose connection, but as I stated, I'll restart the Zoom meeting and answer questions. So NDS, execute immediately. Basically, I talked about the stages of SQL, described dynamic SQL to create SQL statements, list 4 PL SQL statements supporting native NDS, and describe the benefits of NDS and execute immediate over DBMS SQL for dynamic SQL. All right, so I'm going to let the session end, but I will restart it. So if you have questions, please come back on. If you do not, I will definitely answer your questions via email, etc. Any performance concerns for dynamic SQL? In our scenarios, Peter, and our database, not really. Now, if you go into more complex scenarios, maybe. But you probably won't see that with Oracle right now because of the way they've structured the system function.